and lovely to be with you. And thank you to everyone who shared questions. Stefan already mentioned, we went through the questions and we had a look at them and thought, what would be a good order? What would be a good way to maybe combine some of the questions, to turn this into hopefully a meaningful conversation.
Shall we start with the first one? So for me, a product owner is an expert in product management. For example, a product manager who takes on product owner role within a Scrum team. My colleagues think that's not the case. What do you think?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking. I hope it's okay to try and approach this question in a slight roundabout way by kind of going back to the term product owner. And the question is about what's the difference between a product owner and product manager? Is there any difference, right? And so, one way to then approach answering this question is to say, what is a product owner? And the product owner, as I'm sure you know, emerged within the Scrum framework. And so the current version of the Scrum Guide that was, published in November 2020 defines the product owner as somebody who is accountable for maximizing the value of the product, the value that the product creates. And I think, that's something the Scrum framework has suggested pretty consistently for quite a long time. Now, that itself may sound reasonable, but I don't think it's necessarily that helpful. So product owner is a compound noun. What can we do? Well, we can break this compound noun into its elements and think about what is a product and what does it mean to own a product, right? So, and for me, that's very useful because I find that many organizations aren't clear what a product is, not certainly when it comes to digital products, to software products. And so often there is not a shared understanding that different product people, teams really have that same understanding of what we mean by a product. And for a long time, the Scrum framework didn't offer any explanation. I think the latest Scrum Guide tries to address that. So here's my definition of what a product is, which is, I think, pretty much in line with what's suggested in the Scrum Guide. So for me, a product is an asset. In the case of a digital product, it's software, possibly something else. So an asset that creates value for users and possibly customers, and at the same time for the company developing and providing it. And I would argue that a product has to be able to do this largely on its own. And so if you go to an online store and you search for a product, for instance, then just the ability to search for a product would probably be more like a feature, at least in my mind, rather than a product in its own right. And so, technically, it may be quite challenging to implement and provide the search functionality. And there may be a dedicated team that does it. But from a user perspective, it's probably part of a user journey, a multi-step process. And from a business perspective, you probably want more than just, find out what kind of products people search. You really want to convert the user and really hope that the person makes a positive purchase decision and buys something from you, right? So now if that is a product, what does it mean to own a product? And I find there's been confusion about this for a long time. What does it really mean to own a product? Now, for me, it means to be empowered to make not only the tactical product decisions that you would capture in a product backlog, but also the strategic ones. So own a product holistically. And I'll say more about this in a minute. And if that's the case, then I think it's okay to ask the person who plays this role to be responsible or accountable for achieving product success, for maximizing the value that the product creates. Maybe that's helpful to get started, just to clarify our understanding of what it means to be a product owner. Now, if that's what a product owner is, then what about the difference to a product manager, if there is any? And in order to explore this question, and I'm now trying to answer the actual question, I've used a simplified version of Mike Cohen's planning onion. So we have vision, strategy, and tactics here. You can think of the vision as the positive change you want to bring about, the ultimate reason why you create your product. An example I like to use is healthy eating, for a product that helps people become more aware of what they eat and when they eat and how much they eat and so forth. And then strategy will be the approach that we've chosen to realize the vision and the way we want to achieve product success. It might be to offer a healthy eating app aimed at middle-aged men like myself to reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, for instance. So that'd be some elements of a strategy. And then, we might also want to go and create a product roadmap to then make the strategy maybe a little bit more detailed and formulate and anticipate some product goals. And then the tactics will be the information that we keep in the product backlog, the detailed tactical product decisions. Now, for me, a product owner in Scrum should have what I like to call full stack ownership, which means really own the product in its entirety, as I said earlier. have not only the authority to make tactical decisions, but be empowered to make strategic product decisions and be the person who kind of champions the vision and creates some hopefully fundamental alignment of the stakeholders and development teams around the vision. And I personally have always looked at the product owner as a product manager in an agile context, or as a product manager who works in an agile context. And I think the first product owners I worked with were product managers that retrained as product owners. But then, of course, that's not the only perspective. That's not the only view you get out there. And I guess, that's what the question says. Some people regard the product owner more as a tactical role, and that's particularly noticeable in the SAFe framework. So I'm not a SAFe expert, but my understanding of the roles in SAFe is that there is a product owner, and the product owner is focused on the product backlog or part of a product backlog, a team product backlog, and is more inward facing, works with one or more development teams. And if that's how you define the product owner role, then first of all, the individual who exercises this role has partial ownership. And second, you then have to think about complementing this tactical product owner with a more strategic outward-facing role. And my understanding is in SAFe, that's the product manager. So what SAFe does essentially here, in order to facilitate scaling, in order to facilitate developing a big product with many teams, is to split the product owner role into two: outward-facing strategic product manager and inward-facing tactical product owner. Now, personally, I think, at least in hindsight, that's rather unfortunate. First of all, it's created even more confusion about what the product owner role is and isn't. And secondly, it's not always necessarily the best way to scale up. So, it can be helpful in certain circumstances. Typically, my experience suggests when there is stability, so when your product experiences a phase of stability or has matured. But when the strategy is changeable, is volatile, then that approach can be difficult because, in the worst case, the strategic and the tactical decisions, they're not aligned. So the strategic decisions don't guide the tactical ones, and insights from the tactical work doesn't inform the strategic decision making, and that'd be a shame. So in my mind, the Scrum product owner is like a product manager. So I'll write this down here. So I would say the Scrum product owner is an Agile or the Agile product manager. And maybe a final thought on this question. Some of you might know Scrum's been around for quite a while, and the very first version of Scrum was described, I believe, in a paper that was presented at Uppsala 95. And if I'm not mistaken, then this paper does not contain the role of a product owner, but it talks about product management and a product manager. So before Scrum introduced a product owner role, there was a product manager. And then in the subsequent years, Ken Schwaber, who's been mainly responsible for coining the Scrum terms, changed the role to product owner. And one of the reasons, as far as I know, is to emphasize the level of empowerment that product people require in an Agile context, to emphasize the level of empowerment and decision-making authority. Now, you might ask why, particularly in an Agile environment. Well, again, as I'm sure you know, in an Agile environment, we value collaboration. We value bringing people together. We invite people to share their views and perspectives. But if you now have one or more cross-functional development teams present, you then have a group of diverse stakeholders present, and you maybe add some users and customers to the mix, and maybe a sponsor or some other interested people. That can be quite a large group. It can be quite a diverse, heterogeneous group. So it may not be possible then to get to a consensus or reach some form of agreement pretty quickly. And in that case, I think the product owner needs to be empowered to make a decision, be adequately authorized and respected. So that's why maybe product people in an Agile context require, it's especially important for them to be fully empowered. I hope that helped answer the question.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question. That is a long one. At my organization, we have a division of product owner role because for some reasons I have to come to believe that the product owner cannot do everything. Now we have product managers who look after commercials and customers, and product owners who work with the team, so normal Scrum product owner. How can this setup be successful? What to say to the high-ups that this model is not efficient, if that is the case? And if for some reason is a good model, how to manage product manager to stop believing that they are sitting on the high horse and are managing the product owners. Subsequent, what does the organization have to do in order to avoid the division of the role?
Another great question. Thank you for sharing. And I guess It's related to the first one. So again, we have a product manager and a product owner, and sort of just kind of looking at the comments in the chat. Please don't get hung up about SAFe. I'm not suggesting that SAFe is a great scaling framework. I'm not suggesting that it is the opposite. I try and be neutral. I used SAFe here as an example of how you can split a Scrum product owner role into a product manager and product owner. Now here we have again something similar, a role that was intended or is intended, at least in my understanding, to have this full stack ownership is split into a product manager, seems a more strategic role or commercial role, and then a product owner who seems to be more hands-on with the development teams and seems to be, I hope I'm not misinterpreting this, more tactical, right? So, if this split is a good approach or not, I think it's really hard to answer, generally speaking, without understanding a little bit more about your product and the organization. As I suggested earlier, that split can work and it can be effective when two things hold true. The first one, that's the fact I've already mentioned, is when there's an element of stability and your strategy has stabilized. That tends to be the case when your product is growing steadily or once your product has entered maturity, if you're familiar with the product lifecycle model. So there's some stability and you're not really kind of still trying to reach product market fit. The product is not brand new, or you're not about to make any really big changes to your product, like completely redesigning the user experience, ripping out some of the core technologies, or trying to get it ready to release it to a new market or market segment. So there's an area of stability. I think that tends to be beneficial. And then the second thing that tends to be beneficial is the people who share essentially product ownership here in this model, the person who plays the product manager in this more tactical product owner role. And, I'd say that's not really a product owner, because the person doesn't really own a product, but owns part of a product. And in a way, you could also say that this person is really a product manager, but really owns or manages part of a product, so that you establish a good and close collaboration between those individuals. Now, how do you do that? I think a key element is really to build trust. And building trust means that people get to know each other, that people act with integrity, and that they're being honest and transparent, and that they try and involve each other where it makes sense in the decision-making processes. So personally, I think it's helpful when somebody who focuses more on the tactical realm is at least to a certain extent involved in the strategic decision-making processes, in reviewing and adapting a product strategy, and in assessing and changing a product roadmap, for instance. And I think equally people who are more strategic, product people who are more focused on the commercial aspects and the market and the users and customers, I think it's still beneficial for them to understand how the strategic decisions are translated into more tactical items and be familiar, at least roughly on a high level, with the product backlog, so that there's actually some collaboration. That's the other thing that's very helpful to try and bring about. Now, of course, splitting that role is not the only way to deal with a large product. There are other approaches. There are a few ways to scale the product owner role that I found useful, so I thought I'd share them with you. I talked about the product lifecycle model earlier. That's what I'm using here. So the product lifecycle model looks at the value that the product creates over time. And you can see there are 3 key events in the life of a product: launch, product market fit, and end of life. And what I've tried to illustrate here is to recommend that initially it probably makes sense to try and have a single product person, a single product owner, look after the entire product. But then as your product grows and attracts more features, typically that's sort of around product market fit and then into the growth stage, often it's just no longer possible for one person to own or manage the product, and you have to consider sharing product ownership. Now, how can you do this? Well, one way we've already seen, the SAFe way. I'll get back to that, or a technique at least that SAFe uses, but that's not necessarily the only way or the best way, as I've already indicated. Another way to do this, on this slide, my fonts have gone funny. Apologies, I don't quite know why that is, but hopefully you can still get the gist of it. Another way to do this is to work with a product owner team. And so here we have an overall product owner or Scrum product owner. And then we have other more specialized roles here: feature owner and component owner. Now, a feature owner, as the name suggests, is somebody who owns a product part, an end-user-facing product part, a product feature. So, for instance, search and navigation on an online store might be a feature. A component owner is somebody who owns an architecture building block. That might be a component in the traditional sense, like an enterprise Java bean, for instance, that comes to mind, or maybe more likely a service, or a bundle of microservices, or a layer, or a subsystem. Now, generally speaking, I find it helpful to minimize the amount of component teams and component owners, but sometimes it can make sense to use the role of a component owner. And the idea here with this scaling approach is that rather than splitting the product owner role into a strategic and tactical one, you have a Scrum product owner who has overall product ownership. So it's admittedly a little bit more outward facing. And you then have feature owners and maybe a few component owners who focus on their product parts, but are still involved at least to a certain extent in the strategic decision-making process. And the Scrum product owner would still be involved in prioritizing the overall product backlog. So that's one option. And that's not too distinct or too different from what LESS suggests. LESS is another scaling framework. In huge LESS, I believe you get area product owners, but I'm not a scaling expert, so don't hold me to it. I do know Bas Vodde from way back, one of the LESS founders. So I had an email conversation with Bas about the difference between feature owners, as I've tried to define them here, area product owners. But yeah, so in huge LESS, they're area product owners, and they're like a little bit similar to feature owners, I guess you could say. But that's not the only option. Instead of kind of sharing product owner responsibility, you could also consider breaking up your product. And there are two ways to do this. You can unbundle a larger feature. That's what Facebook did many years ago with the Messenger app. Some of you may still remember that was 5, 6, 7 years ago now, quite a while. Facebook unbundled, spun off the Messenger feature from the mobile app into an app in its own right. And what that does is it makes the original product more focused, and it creates a new, smaller product with a new product owner and one or two new development teams. So it essentially reduces the size of the original product. So it can be useful for the users, simplifies the user experience, creates a clear value proposition. It can also be useful for the company. You can do all sorts of things with Messenger these days, including financial transactions, I believe. That probably would have been difficult if they've kept it within the main Facebook app. And creating variants would be something that YouTube did in recent years. Think about YouTube Kids, for instance, as a variant of plain old vanilla YouTube or YouTube Premium these days. I think it used to be called YouTube Red, where you subscribe to YouTube and then you don't get the ads and you can download videos. And I think you get YouTube Music for free, something along those lines. And I'm just mentioning this because I think particularly in the Agile community, in Agile scaling discussions, that option, which from a product management perspective, I think is a great one and a very viable one and often very attractive as your product continues to grow and attract more and more features. That option is often overlooked. So, again, something maybe to consider. And then the final option would be to use that strategic and tactical product owner role. And I think that's what we have in the question. And as I've pointed out a couple of times before, I think that can work when people get on well, number one. There's good communication, there's good collaboration between the strategic product people and the tactical ones, but also your product is experiencing a phase of stability. And certainly the strategy is not volatile at this stage. Otherwise, I wouldn't recommend it. Otherwise, I'd probably do something more along those lines here, this model. So which one is right for you? I'll have to leave that decision to you. My suggestion is get together and have something like a retrospective. You might want to involve your Scrum Masters in the conversation, might be a good idea. And look at what's worked well with the current setup, with having product managers and product owners, and look at the drawbacks and then have a discussion about, okay, how could we preserve what is good and how could we overcome the issues that we're experiencing?
I think you already covered the next question, which is actually about how to make this work. You have a product manager for strategy and a product owner for the tactical stuff. However, there was another question I found really interesting on the chat that was referring to the role of the Scrum Master. How can a Scrum Master help a product owner, for example, in these kind of suboptimal organizational design situations to really become great at their work?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. So, for those of you who work as product owners and maybe feel that the organizational context isn't always conducive to being fully empowered and have full stack ownership and all those good things, your Scrum Master can be a great ally. Scrum Masters should be responsible for organizational change and development in terms of facilitating it, helping to facilitate it, helping to move the organization forward, not only coaching development teams. Ideally, a Scrum Master, I would argue, is a valuable sparring partner for you as well. So if you've got any concerns about how the product owner role is understood, how it's applied, your Scrum Master should be somebody who you can go to and have a helpful conversation with. And so that's what I would suggest you do. Then you go to your Scrum Master, assuming you've got a Scrum Master, and share your concerns concerns with the Scrum Master and ask the Scrum Master, how can you help me? And maybe together you can influence the decision makers in the organization. Maybe together you can point out some of the drawbacks when product owners aren't fully empowered, or product owners are kind of restricted more to the tactical product decisions. For instance, that strategic product decisions aren't necessarily seamlessly translated into tactical ones, and that insights from the tactical work aren't necessarily always taken into account in order to evolve and update and improve the product strategy. I mean, in the worst case, there's a disconnect, which is something, by the way, I've experienced a few times. We had the setup here on the right-hand side, or organizations used the setup on the right-hand side, and there was then a real disconnect between the strategic decision maker and the tactical product person.
I think that was really helpful because it introduced one other role into the whole conflict situation, conflict scheme. And we actually have a question that is introducing yet another role, which is now referring to the business analyst. So in the context of a company developing software for another company, B2B, what would you say are the differences between the product owner role, the product manager role, and the business analyst role?
Yeah, it's another really interesting question. I think we've talked about product owner, product manager, and again, as is written here on this slide, for me, the Scrum product owner, product owner in Scrum, as I understand that the role is intended within the Scrum framework, really is like a product manager in an Agile context. But what about the business analyst? And as it happens, I've got a slide here that shows a couple of options. Business analysts don't feature in Scrum, as I'm sure you know, but still many organizations use business analysts. So what can we do then when we transition into an Agile Scrum-based environment and use Scrum as a development process? Well, one option is that the business analyst becomes a team member. But of course, that's a change to the role. It means that the business analyst is no longer specialized and focused on, say, eliciting requirements and describing requirements and understanding how business processes work and maybe how they can be improved, and then communicating those requirements to one or more development teams. The business analyst might be really well suited to work with the product owner, and other team members on the product backlog and carry out product backlog refinement. But just like any other team member, the business analyst, would not necessarily just have one specialization, but be expected to pick up other tasks as well. So I think it's a change of the role. And then the second option that maybe is a little bit more common in my experience is that business analysts work as product owners or feature owners. And again, just to remind you, feature owner is a role that I like to use just to differentiate between somebody who owns a product in its entirety, the entire product, and is also then responsible really for value creation and for a commercial product. That means, for the monetization of the product, and a feature owner would own an end user facing product capability. So, often a good first step would be to take on the role as a feature owner, or maybe product owner of a not critical product, just to grow into the role, depending on what the business analyst has done before and how much experience the individual has. But again, often my experience suggests that's a change. It's a change that often requires acquiring or deepening skills. So these are the two options that, as I said, I've come across and I found useful.
What would be the 3 must-haves for a product owner?
Yeah, that's another good question. So I think in the past, I've suggested that an effective product owner is, first of all, available. And so my preference has been for many years to work with full-time professional product owners. So to give someone the opportunity to grow into the role. Now, being an effective product owner requires, I think, a set of diverse skills, a fairly broad range of skills. Now, we've talked about strategic decision-making, we've talked about tactical decision-making. There are also a number of interpersonal skills, leadership skills that are really valuable around goal setting, around collaborative decision-making, around trust building, relationship building, stakeholder management, empathizing, developing an awareness around personal leadership preferences and leadership styles that I think really valuable. Strategic skills are things around product strategy, creating a product strategy, validating a product strategy, reviewing and updating a product strategy, deriving a product roadmap, adapting that roadmap, working with a business model, creating a financial forecast, knowing about the product lifecycle model, just some examples. And then, of course, all the tactical space involves product backlog management, stocking a product backlog, prioritizing that backlog, refining items, updating items, testing out ideas for features, knowing when you should choose a method like a product demo, when a usability test, when should you do an early release, working with the development team and having at least a technical a rough technical understanding, or at least a strong technical interest or interest in the technologies used to build the product, I would suggest it's quite a diverse range. And so I think it's only fair to give people the time and dedications to acquire and hone those skills, deepen those skills, and become experienced, become really good at being a product owner. A training course obviously can be very useful, but that's always just going to be a start. From my experience, I can only say it usually takes people years to become a competent product owner. And I'm not trying sort of to make this sound unattainable or really super difficult, but I think it can be great fun and really enjoyable and rewarding being a product owner, but it does require dedication and it does require a certain skill set. And then committed, I think, is maybe something that is helpful too. Committed in the sense that, how should I put this? There's a certain dedication to the product, or the product resonates with you. So I like to suggest that it's helpful to look at the product vision. And if you feel that the vision, the ultimate purpose of the product, the positive change it should bring about is something that you believe is meaningful, then you can probably be committed to the product. And then the other thing would also be the people. Then has to do with being willing to build trust and being willing to treat people kindly. And then also the process in terms of agile principles and agile practices. And then qualified. And I think I've already mentioned qualified indirectly because I've talked about being a necessity of having sufficient availability and focus. Sort of here are the three skills, that's sort of the little skills model I like to use for product people. Here are the three skills areas I mentioned: tactical, strategic, and leadership skills. I find it helpful to point out that being a competent product owner, Scrum product owner, means more than the tactical skills. I mean, Scrum is from my perspective, a development framework. So, it talks about product increments, it talks about a product backlog, it talks about sprints. Fortunately, I'd say the latest Scrum guide talks about a product goal now as well, but really it's not a product management framework. And so, sometimes that means that people have a very kind of, maybe to a certain extent, a distorted or limited outlook on the product owner role and think like it's just a tactical role and just requires tactical skills. And again, as I've tried to argue probably throughout most of this session, that's probably mistaken. So again, strategic and leadership skills are important, particularly if you manage a product in its entirety, or if you want to move into a more senior product owner position, then these skills will become even more important.
I totally agree. Regarding the product owner as a mere tactical role is leading to a mediocre outcome. I do believe that Scrum teams can create more value for our customers if the attitude towards the role of the product owner changes, moving away from this tactical perspective.
Yeah. Oh, Stefan, by the way, I just saw a question in the chat. Somebody's asking, what is a professional product owner? So professional in the sense that somebody really focuses on the role, and that's the role the individual plays. In the past, I've worked with product owners who also play various other roles, from being an executive comes to mind, to being a project manager, to being a business analyst, to being a developer, to being a line manager, to being the head of product and the product owner. And, in some instances that may make sense and it may be sustainable, at least for a certain period of time. But I think generally speaking, it's helpful to really focus on owning and managing a product and doing this professionally, in the sense that you acquire the skills, the competencies that are required. So you can do a good job and you can maximize the value that the product creates.
Agreed. And you cannot accomplish this level of professionalism by attending a 2-day class. I can tell you that. It's more like pointing at the rabbit holes. So, okay, this is your job in the next 6 to 12 months. Delve into each of these rabbit holes and try to figure out what's underneath them. Classic thing. There's another question that we had at the beginning, and I really like this one. I was wondering, ask Dina, what is the best way a Scrum Master has ever helped you as a product owner and or a team you've worked with?
That's a cool question. Maybe before I share my personal experience, because this is, I guess, the second Scrum Master question, it might be helpful just to talk a little bit about the 3 Scrum roles and to try and position them, or at least, share my perspective on this. So here, what I've tried to do on this slide is tease out the different core responsibilities or leadership aspects that the 3 roles provide, at least in my opinion. So we have the Scrum product owner should offer product leadership. We have, and that's sort of, setting a vision, ensuring there is a valid or validated product strategy, actionable product roadmap available. There's a product backlog that contains the right stuff, that's focused on a product goal, that's prioritized and collaborate with the stakeholders. And then we have cross-functional development team or group of developers who should, I believe, do the UX design, make all the architecture, technology decisions, be responsible for ensuring that the software has the right quality, and self-organize. And then, as you can see, there's some shared responsibility between the product owner and the development team. Then we have the Scrum Master. And for me, the Scrum Master really offers a service to the product owner and the development team, and acts as a process and method coach, also helps with collaboration, but not only to the Scrum product owner and development team, but also to the stakeholders and the wider organization. So the Scrum Masters that I remember from my work were individuals who were good with people and had a warm but firm approach to interacting with others. So, honest and warm and kind, but also candid and direct and honest, not beating around the bush, not shying away from difficult conversations or problems. Scrum Masters that I remember were also good at not only interacting with development teams, product owners, but with the decision makers in the organizations and trying to influence them and build trust with them. I don't know if that is helpful, but for me, as a Scrum Master, it's the leadership aspects and the people aspects that I think are really crucial to succeed, maybe even more so than for product owners. That's just my perspective. And I'm not necessarily a Scrum Master expert.
Are the expert in complex environments? That's always the same question. So the next questions are starting to branch out a bit further into the Scrum framework. And I found this question for Dominic interesting in the chat. What is your tip when your management has a different understanding of the product owner role? Like your management thinks it's just a fancy new name for a project manager and overburdens you with responsibilities product owner shouldn't actually do.
Yeah, another great question. And to a certain extent, I think this diagram might actually help with this, because if you find that the understanding in the organization of the Scrum product owner role is not effective or not correct, then your Scrum Master, assuming you've got a Scrum Master who is available and adequately qualified, will be a great partner to address the issue. And you might be able to team up and think about, okay, how can you bring about change? How can you influence the people in the organization that make the decisions and decide on the roles, and would have to empower product owners or would have to support product owners so that they can act with the necessary level of empowerment. Maybe go and talk to your Scrum Master. That's one approach. The other approach would be to turn this into a certain extent into a group effort, build an alliance with other product owners in the organization, and try not just as an individual product owner to create some change by influencing the decision makers, but again, turn this into a group effort, align with other product people, other product owners in the organization, and that might help you to maybe create more momentum and instigate a bigger or more lasting change, possibly. And, some of you may disagree, and that's obviously perfectly okay, but it's a tricky one. It's sort of a chicken and egg, but another saying goes, the two to tango. So, if your management or your line manager or the big boss comes to you and says, you're another product owner, but in addition to being the product owner, you do all this other stuff, and I want you to create these project management reports for me, and I don't know, do this big Gantt chart-based plan, for instance, then, there's always the option to kindly but firmly say no and say like, oh, thank you, and help me understand how this would be beneficial, and then point out that actually it wouldn't be beneficial, and actually that is not part of your job, right? Now, of course, I don't know if that is advisable. It will very much depend on leadership culture in your organization and in your position. But, I think sometimes we need to show a certain courage and, have the courage to say no. As a product person, as a product owner, you should be familiar with saying no anyway, right? It's part and parcel of what we do. You can't say yes to every stakeholder request or every idea. And otherwise we end up with a Frankenstein product, a product that's like, looks horrible, it's difficult to use, and has a really poor value proposition, right? And sometimes we need to do the same thing with management. And I think saying no tends to work well when you first listen, and when you first listen with the intention to understand. And you try and explore what is the individual's motivation, what's the underlying concern, or what are the underlying needs. Why does management want you to create, for instance, some project reports, or show them a Gantt chart-based project plan? Why would that be? And so maybe they're worried about this brave new agile way of working. Maybe they're worried about the introduction of this new product owner role. Maybe they just didn't understand it. So, there's a lack of understanding or fragmented knowledge. And once you understand that, then you're in a much better position to say no in the right way, and thereby also maybe help the individual. Something also to consider.
Another good opportunity, by the way, to collaborate with the Scrum Master, because they are actually trained for that purpose, right? And the economics of saying yes, aka saying no to a lot of other things, are also always very interesting. So opportunity cost is an issue, and I believe agile product development, whatever you're using in the end, is far less fluffy than a lot of people believe. You can do a lot based on facts and metrics, actually. Metrics is another good topic, because there's an interesting question regarding one of the artifacts that are really important to product owners. It's about the product backlog. What do you consider to be a good size of a manageable product backlog? Classic question.
That's a very good question. And in order to answer that, I don't have a picture. So I hope you can see this. So this is from a blog post I wrote a few years ago. So generally speaking, I find it impossible to say this is how many items your product backlog should contain, or there's a certain number, a certain threshold, a certain maximum of items that a product backlog can contain. It's like I don't have statistically relevant data to come up with any meaningful numbers and hard guidelines. But I think what we can do is we can take a look at product backlog size and level of detail, and the age of the product, and the level of stability that is being present, or the amount of uncertainty and change. And so as long as there is a significant amount of uncertainty and change, as long as you have a product that is comparatively young or is significantly changing, you probably want to keep your product backlog concise and focused. So the number of techniques that you can use in order to achieve a concise and focused product backlog: number one, use a product goal and only add items to the product backlog that serve this goal. And stick to it. Number two, ensure that the majority of the items, when you stock a product backlog at least, are big and coarse-grained and underspecified, and then only progressively break them down using feedback from users and customers on early product increments. And then, you can use additional techniques such as working with themes or categories in order to hide complexity and roll up detailed items into a category or theme, for instance. But then, if you look to the right of this picture here, you can see there is a bigger product backlog with considerably more detail. And if your product experiences hardly any change, there's really no uncertainty, maybe because your product is mature, it's stable, you focus on small incremental enhancements and bug fixes, there's no reason why your product backlog, at least in my view, why your product backlog couldn't be bigger and more detailed. I think that's perfectly okay. However, when you reflect on the context for which Scrum was designed, then it's more the one on the left of that dotted line. That's probably more a complex space, whereas on the right of this dotted line is probably more a complicated space. So, you can still use Scrum in that space if you wish to, but sometimes actually, I would argue it makes sense to move away from Scrum and consider maybe a sequential Kanban-based process instead. But that's then really a conversation with the Scrum Master and the development team. And it's a common mistake to have a product backlog that grows too big and that grows too fast. And the reason for that is that lack of I'd argue, more strategic objective, like a product goal. A practice I found very useful over the years is to tie your product backlog to the product roadmap. And those of you who are more familiar with my work will know that I have a strong preference of working with goal-oriented, outcome-based roadmaps. And so, if you have already goals on your roadmap and you've anticipated them for the next 6 to 12 months, then you can reuse those goals as product goals and copy them into your product backlog. And then you get this nice, concise, and focused backlog. But again, it means that you have to have the courage to say no, and say no to any items that do not help meet this specific goal. But yeah, I've been asked, the biggest product backlog I was ever confronted with had over 40,000 items. But, I've had quite a few people approach me asking me how they should prioritize their backlogs with more than several thousand items. And generally my answer is don't. Throw it away, start from scratch. Because, chances are that when you're in a situation like this, you lack this strategic overarching goal. You lack this product goal. And so, stuff was put into the product backlog possibly to please individual stakeholders, or because you didn't know it any better, or someone didn't know it any better, and you've possibly inherited this product backlog. But such a big product backlog is usually too unwieldy. It's just too large to be useful. So you might as well throw it away and start afresh.
As I like to say, the trash can is your friend, right? So if you can't remember what it is, throw it away. So it's like administering bugs in some sort of system. You either fix them or you ignore them, but you don't administer them. So a lot of nasty anti-patterns here, I believe. So I think we have time for one more question. So this one is from Rob McDonald from Wellington in New Zealand. Linking product vision to product goals and sprint goals. What's the difference between vision and mission? And do you think it really matters?
Oh, yeah. Good question. I don't know. I think goals can be very powerful. And one of the reasons that Scrum as a framework has always resonated with me is that I believe it's inherently goal-oriented. It's always had a sprint goal. The early Scrum literature champions the idea of a vision as an inspirational goal. And the latest Scrum guide has introduced a product goal. I think that's great. Now, what I've done here, and it's also in my latest book, How to Lead in Product Management, is I've tried to sort of put these different goals together and kind of create a hierarchy of cascading goals that I find useful for product people, for product owners. Now, what's then the difference to a mission? I don't know. I mean, for me, the mission is more like a strategy. I used to work for Intel in the late 90s for a few years. And at Intel, there was a vision that was the long-term aspiration of the company. Back then, there was a mission, and the mission was typically a concise statement that was valid for the current financial year and that helped focus the efforts in the company. And I think when I left in early 2000s, the mission statement was to be or become the preeminent building block supplier of the internet economy. Some of you might remember we talked about the internet economy back then. Doing things in internet time, in hyperspace, of course. Those were the days. Yeah. And so I wouldn't get too hung up about this, but you might find it useful to work with products at different levels and then align those products in a meaningful way. And that's also true for those of you who work with objectives and key results, right? I think the goal setting technique is not the challenge. The challenge really is to formulate the right goals and again, to connect those goals in a meaningful and systematic manner. And so if you're not quite sure what kind of goals you should use and how they can be connected, then you might want to look at this model and see if that's helpful for you. As I said, there's a blog post about this, and it's also in my latest book described in more detail.
Speaking of your latest book, I like to give it away in my product owner classes. So people have something they can go back to and figure out what might be the next possible way or which one to take at the next crossing, so to speak. And it's really, really helpful. I believe it calms nerves and gives people perspective and helps also many practitioners to overcome this imposter syndrome, right? Particularly if they have been thrown into the role and have no, dedicated formalized education. As you rightfully mentioned, it takes years to actually pick up all the little qualifications that this trade is requiring. It doesn't come overnight.
Yeah, cool. That's great to hear. Thank you, Stefan.
Roman, thank you so much for spending your evening with us and answering all these questions. And I hope that everyone enjoyed the session, and maybe there will be an opportunity that you come back and do this again.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was lovely for me to be with you. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I hope it was a little bit useful, what I had to offer. And that was really nice. Happy to come back in the future. And good luck with the product owner role and product owner related practices. It is a challenging role. So, don't despair. There's always room for improvement. Sometimes, a bit of perseverance and patience is what you need. But yeah, no, I hope it was a little bit helpful. Good luck with everything. And I hope to see you again in the future.
Thank you so much.